In the shadows of a war that scorched continents, not everything was destroyed in fire. Some truths were buried, not by chance, but by careful hands, locked in vaults, erased from ledgers, and sealed in corridors where no light was meant to fall again. Imagine records so dangerous they could tilt alliances, or machines so unfinished their silence was more powerful than their roar. Imagine men who vanished not in combat but in the quiet ink of redacted orders, their names consumed by the machinery of secrecy. What remains are fragments, coded transmissions, photographs half-burned, testimonies whispered in fear, that hint at a history deeper than the one carved into monuments. This is not the story told in textbooks or parades. It is the echo of files never meant to surface, the uneasy silence behind declarations of victory, and the uneasy knowledge that some battles were never meant to end. Chapter 1. The Vanished Convoy. To Murmansk. The winter of 1942 was among the most brutal on record in the Arctic, the kind of cold that broke steel and froze diesel in its lines. It was under these conditions that Convoy PQ-17 left Hvalfjörður, Iceland, bound for the Soviet port of Murmansk. The convoy carried tanks, aircraft, ammunition and food, but buried in its manifests were cryptic entries. Radiomagnetic apparatus, Type H and cargo Harlequin, high priority. These items did not appear in Allied supply summaries after the war. British archives described the convoy as a disaster after the Admiralty ordered it to scatter in July 1942. Fearing an imminent strike by the battleship Tirpitz. Over 20 ships were sunk, and thousands of tons of material went to the ocean floor. Yet in the chaos of that retreat, one vessel vanished without trace, not sunk, not confirmed in wreckage lists, simply erased. The ship in question, the SS Mill Hill, was a British freighter, 7,000 tons displacement, crewed largely by civilian sailors. Her cargo was reportedly general stores and vehicles. Survivors from other vessels, however, swore under questioning that Mill Hill carried heavily guarded crates loaded at Scarpa Flow under cover of night. An OSS liaison noted in his diary that Harlequin shipments secured in Compartment 4, restricted access, Royal Navy only. No such diary entry appears in official OSS logs. The ship's last confirmed signal was a shortwave burst intercepted at 21:04 hours on July 5, 1942, in which a wireless officer sent 3 words. Cargo diverted north. No coordinates, no elaboration. Within hours, the ship disappeared from the convoy grid. Post-war analyses labelled Mill Hill a probable U-boat loss. Yet German Kriegsmarine records, meticulous in their tally of sinkings, contain no claim of a kill matching her displacement or position. U-88 and U-703 were in the area, but their war diaries list only attacks on smaller freighters. Luftwaffe reconnaissance sorties over the Barents likewise made no reference to Mill Hill. The possibility that a vessel simply slipped away, without combat, disturbed naval investigators for decades. In 1956, an internal memorandum at the Admiralty surfaced, classified top secret. It referenced convoy diversion PQ-17 element Harlequin. Cargo intercepted, secured. Soviet notification negative. This suggests that the British themselves may have intercepted their own convoy ship, quietly diverting its cargo before it reached Murmansk. The reasoning is clear in context. By mid-1942, Stalin demanded access to every piece of Allied technology, including radar sets and radio countermeasures. The British, fearful of post-war Soviet leverage, may have decided to withhold certain items under the pretext of convoy losses. If true, it was a deception that cost hundreds of sailors their lives while protecting secrets from an ally. In Murmansk, Soviet port authorities documented arrivals of PQ-17 survivors. They noted the absence of one freighter, but curiously, no inquiry was launched. A smuggled NKVD report later uncovered in the 1990s by Russian historians mentions Angliski kорабль исчез, вероятно предан. The English ship disappeared, likely betrayed. Such language was never made public in the Soviet press. Stalin's government had an interest in downplaying betrayal, especially during a period when Allied aid was critical to the Red Army's survival at Stalingrad. Eyewitnesses add unsettling detail. A sailor from the freighter Silver Sword, in testimony recorded in 1964, described seeing Mill Hill break formation after the scatter order. Instead of fleeing west like others, she turned northeast, running darkened under blackout. No distress rockets, no SOS, he recalled. They steamed silent as if they had their own orders. Within 2 days, she was gone. No wreckage ever washed ashore. American intelligence files show indirect awareness of Harlequin. A 1943 OSS briefing note mentions British control of magnetic deflection devices withheld from Soviet partner pending field trials. Later references vanish. Researchers suspect these devices were early iterations of chaff countermeasures, thin strips of aluminum foil that could blind German radar, a technology crucial for bomber defense and U-boat evasion. If Stalin had obtained these in 1942, it might have altered the balance of Soviet-German aerial warfare, but it also would have handed Moscow a decisive post-war advantage in radio-electronic intelligence. Theories about the Mill Hill's fate range widely. Some suggest she was redirected to a secret anchorage in Greenland, her cargo unloaded onto Royal Navy tenders and transported south in secrecy. Others believe American operatives seized her at sea under Anglo-American agreement, ensuring that neither side would have to admit the theft to the Soviets. The lack of survivor accounts, no distress calls, no reported attacks, supports the idea that her disappearance was controlled, not accidental. Declassified maps show a series of Royal Navy shadow stations along the Arctic routes, including temporary bases on Jan Mayen and Bear Island. These were officially weather and observation posts, but shipping logs reveal unusually heavy traffic during the week of PQ-17's disaster. An entry in the HMS Norfolk's war diary cryptically reads, "Detachment delivered. Retrieval successful. Harlequin secured." Norfolk, a heavy cruiser, was never reported to have engaged enemy vessels during that week. Its detachment log remains missing. By the 1970s, conspiracy theories about the vanished convoy began to circulate in naval history circles. The Ministry of Defense dismissed them as Cold War paranoia. Yet in 1981, a Soviet naval officer defected in Helsinki, bringing with him excerpts of wartime reports. Among them, a decoded British message intercepted by Soviet signals intelligence, instructing one vessel to proceed per Harlequin orders. The name of the vessel was redacted, but coordinates matched the last known grid of Mill Hill. The Soviets had suspected betrayal all along, but lacked evidence strong enough to challenge their allies during wartime. What remains most chilling is the silence. Families of the Mill Hill crew received standard casualty letters. Lost with all hands, presumed enemy action. No memorial plaques mention Harlequin. No admiral ever acknowledged that a ship vanished without a trace, not sunk, not sighted again. In the decades after, Arctic storms and ice buried whatever wreckage might have been found. To this day, sonar surveys in the Barents Sea have uncovered dozens of PQ-17 wrecks, yet never one conclusively identified as Mill Hill. The vanished convoy remains a ghost in naval history. It embodies the cruel calculus of wartime alliances, where even partners withheld from one another the most critical technologies. Men were sacrificed not only against German torpedoes, but against the politics of secrecy. A freighter, a cargo, an entire crew disappeared into a classified void. The record is not of tragedy alone, but of deliberate erasure. The name Harlequin, written once in faded ink in Admiralty files, lingers as the only clue. And still, the question persists. Was the Mill Hill sunk by enemy fire, or quietly swallowed by the very hands sworn to protect her? In the icy dark of July 1942, somewhere between Iceland and Murmansk, the truth was locked away, and the sea became the final archive. Chapter 2. Shadows Beneath the Nuremberg Trials. The Nuremberg Trials are remembered as the ultimate reckoning of Nazi crimes, yet few outside classified archives know how much was omitted, redacted or buried in the name of post-war stability. Convened in November 1945, the International Military Tribunal prosecuted leading figures of the Third Reich in a bombed-out city still thick with ash. Cameras rolled, reporters filled the galleries, and transcripts were carefully distributed. But in the sealed records of the US War Department and the British Foreign Office lie suppressed testimonies that tell a different story, one that casts long shadows across the so-called triumph of justice. Among these hidden files is a testimony transcript dated January 7, 1946, from SS Obersturmbannführer Erich Weiss, attached to Sonderkommando Reichslicht, a technical unit allegedly formed in 1944 in Lower Silesia. His official presence at Nuremberg is unrecorded, yet his name appears in a classified annex attached to Trial Series 5, coded as Exhibit X342. In the suppressed account, Weiss described underground installations near Waldenburg, where conscripted laborers constructed reinforced hangars and tunnels under orders from the Luftwaffe's Forschungsamt. These facilities, he claimed, housed test stands for rocket engines and jet assemblies dismantled and shipped before Soviet forces closed in. None of this testimony was presented publicly. Instead, Weiss's statement was excised, and his name disappeared from official records. British intelligence memos now declassified suggest why. A Foreign Office note from March 1946 instructs: remove all reference to Silesian subterranean works. Intelligence value to ongoing projects outweighs tribunal interest. The note bore the initials of Sir William Strang, a senior diplomat overseeing British participation in the trials. The implication is clear. Certain revelations threatened to expose not only Nazi crimes, but also Allied exploitation of those crimes. The Americans, too, had their own reasons for silence. Project Paperclip, formally approved in August 1945, had already begun extracting German scientists for work on US missile programs. Werner von Braun, Arthur Rudolph, and others were technically subjects of war crimes investigation, yet none were indicted at Nuremberg. Their dossiers were sanitized. An Office of Strategic Services memorandum, marked "For Donovan's Eyes Only," outlined which names were to be shielded and which testimonies must never reach the tribunal's open record. Selection based on technical value was the operative phrase. Witnesses also vanished. Hans Kammler, SS General and overseer of V weapons production, disappeared in May 1945 under contested circumstances. German sources claimed suicide, yet US Army interrogation summaries place him alive in custody weeks later. No trace of him appears in the trial documentation. In 1969, a CIA file labeled Kammler Group was quietly declassified, referencing consultations with Kammler in post-war Europe concerning propulsion research. The absence of his name from Nuremberg is not accident, but design. Even more telling are the minutes from secret prosecutor conferences. An American prosecutor, Telford Taylor, noted in his private diary that whole swaths of evidence on Reich research facilities have been pulled. Justice loses to politics. He could not speak publicly, but his handwritten journals, now in Columbia University archives, corroborate claims of deliberate omissions. Soviet representatives likewise protested during closed sessions, accusing the Americans of concealing the extent of Luftwaffe experimental programs. These protests never reached the press. Some suppressed testimonies dealt with atrocities too vast for the Allies to expose without implicating their own governments in complicity. Reports from Einsatzgruppen mass killings were selectively read, yet documents showing the involvement of Western industrial concerns with the Reich's war machine were locked away. In particular, IG Farben's relationships with American companies were carefully minimized in open court. A French prosecutor's memorandum, later censored, complained that economic collusion in wartime production is being obscured at the behest of London and Washington. At least one physical shipment of files vanished in transit. In December 1945, crates of Gestapo and SS records captured in the Harz Mountains were logged at a US Army depot in Frankfurt, tagged for Nuremberg evidence review. By February 1946, they had disappeared from the chain of custody. An Army CID investigation concluded they had been reallocated to intelligence, a euphemism for removal by the counterintelligence corps. Their contents remain unknown. The effect was to stage manage Nuremberg as both justice and theatre. The crimes that fit the narrative, mass executions, forced labour, aggressive war, were exposed. But anything that implicated the Allies in covert cooperation or suggested usable military technology was suppressed. The Soviets, eager to weaponize captured German science for themselves, played their own game of concealment. Soviet prosecutors downplayed evidence of their 1939 pact with Hitler, excising references to joint Gestapo-NKVD meetings in occupied Poland. When Polish underground reports surfaced describing mass deportations to Siberia, the Soviets dismissed them as falsifications. Yet within these layers of omission, one can still trace the outline of a larger hidden history. Technical annexes on long-range missile guidance, referenced in closed sessions, never appeared in trial records but resurface in NATO scientific reports by 1952. Propulsion research files, allegedly destroyed, reappear in the archives of Redstone Arsenal in Alabama. The Reich's erased facilities in Silesia match exactly the coordinates of later Soviet missile ranges in Kazakhstan. The tribunal's silence was not absence, but substitution, evidence flowing into secret arsenals instead of public judgment. Eyewitnesses at the time sensed the distortion. Journalists complained of restricted access to certain witness sessions, of interpreters instructed to omit phrases, of sealed documents never explained. A reporter for the Manchester Guardian wrote in March 1946, "We are told justice is absolute here, but papers vanish into sealed envelopes faster than they appear before judges." The article was pulled from later editions. In the years after, official histories continued to present Nuremberg as the definitive exposure of Nazi guilt. Yet researchers who gained access to restricted files in the 1970s found gaps too large to ignore. Why, for instance, were interrogation reports from Mittelwerk engineers never submitted, though these men later appeared in American aerospace contracts? Why were early references to concentration camp medical experiments on hypothermia edited when US Air Force documents in 1950 directly cited German data for pilot survival studies? The answer lies in the calculus of post-war power. For Britain and the United States, the imperative was not merely to punish, but to absorb. For the Soviets, it was to conceal and appropriate. Justice was theatre for public consumption, while beneath the surface, the real trial was one of assets. Scientists, research, files, technology. The guilty were not always punished. They were often recruited. Thus, the shadows beneath Nuremberg stretch long into the Cold War. When NATO tested its first guided missiles, when the Soviets launched Sputnik, when CIA archives later revealed their reliance on wartime German dossiers, they were all extensions of testimony never spoken, evidence never admitted. The tribunal gave the world a story of justice triumphant. In the sealed corridors behind the courtroom, another story unfolded, of bargains struck, of crimes erased, of men who should have stood condemned but instead walked into new laboratories, carrying with them the silent spoils of the Reich. The Nuremberg trials ended in October 1946 with executions and long prison terms. Yet for every judgment handed down, there remained a suppressed counterpart, hidden in annexes stamped secret. Justice was rendered for the cameras, but in the archives, silence was the truer verdict. The shadows, more than the spotlight, defined what Nuremberg really was. Not the final word on the war, but the first word in a new one. Chapter 3. Operation Silver Ashes in Bavaria. In the final weeks of the war, April 1945, the Bavarian Alps were collapsing under the weight of advancing Allied columns. American armoured units of the 3rd Infantry Division pushed south toward Berchtesgaden, while elements of the British 1st Airborne prepared for mountain operations. Most histories describe this thrust as the capture of Hitler's Alpine redoubt, but a sealed Office of Strategic Services file tells a different story. Labelled Operation Silver Ashes, it outlines a clandestine mission to penetrate a hidden Luftwaffe research cell deep in the Obersalzberg Massif to secure or destroy experimental technology before it could fall to the Soviets. The file begins with a fragmentary order signed April 23, 1945, by OSS Station Chief Alan Dulles in Bern. It directs Major Robert H. Kehoe, attached to the 2677th Regiment OSS, to lead a combined Anglo-American team of 14 men into Sector Steinadler, a code name for fortified tunnels carved into the rock east of Berchtesgaden. Their objective: eliminate research personnel, seize documents, and neutralize any hardware deemed of post-war consequence. The order references jet propulsion apparatus, anomalous type, and propellant systems. Category Red. Official US Army reports record only the capture of Berchtesgaden on May 4, 1945. They do not mention Steinadler or the OSS detachment, but aerial reconnaissance photographs taken 2 days later, held in RAF archives until their release in 1991, show the scorched remains of reinforced bunkers tucked into the slope. One image depicts a hangar-like entrance sealed by demolition charges. Another shows metallic wreckage strewn on a mountain ledge, burned beyond recognition. Margins of the photo are scrawled with the word thermite. Local testimony adds further weight. Residents of Ramsau recalled explosions in the mountains at night, louder than artillery, followed by Allied patrols forbidding entry into Alpine trails. An innkeeper, interrogated by US MPs, spoke of trucks moving under blackout conditions towards Salzburg, loaded with tarpaulin-covered crates. His statement never appeared in public records, but survives in a Bavarian police archive. The most telling evidence comes from missing equipment logs. The Luftwaffe Forschungsamt maintained a registry of experimental aircraft prototypes, including Messerschmitt's jet derivatives and rocket-assisted interceptors. Several entries marked assigned Obersalzberg April 1945 have no post-war disposition. Unlike other prototypes later tested by the Allies, these vanished. A U.S. Army Air Forces technical officer, Captain Charles Winfield, wrote in his debriefing that wreckage salvaged near Steinadler tunnels, configuration unknown, wings truncated, fuselage scorched. His notes were censored in the final report. What Operation Silver Ashes achieved may never be fully known, but circumstantial traces suggest the mission successfully extracted materials before erasing the facility. Declassified shipping manifests from Marseille show a sealed consignment marked machinery, scrap metal, 24 crates, escorted under OSS guard, leaving for New York aboard the SS John Ericsson on June 12, 1945. The shipment does not match any declared war material. A customs inspector's marginal note reads simply, "Unusual weight for size." The timing aligns with the scramble for German technology already underway. Paperclip extractions were in full swing, and the Soviets were racing to seize Peenemünde engineers. Silver Ashes appears to have been an urgent strike to ensure certain experimental data stayed out of Soviet hands. One memorandum within the file states bluntly, "Denial of access priority exceeds preservation priority." This explains the thermite charges, which destroyed anything too large to move. Survivors of the mission spoke rarely, but fragments surface. Sergeant Paul Dyer, interviewed in 1972 by a historian of the OSS, recalled descending into a half-collapsed tunnel and finding racks of cylinders and wing sections stacked like cordwood. He described papers written in technical German, stamped with Reichsluftfahrtministerium seals, that were hastily packed into canvas sacks. His account ends with the arrival of demolition teams who rigged charges in the cavern. "We barely got clear before the whole place went up," he said. The Soviets were not blind to the erasure. A GRU situation report from June 1945, declassified in Moscow during the 1990s, accuses the Allies of systematic destruction of Alpine facilities. The report laments that Red Army units advancing through Austria found only ruins and slag, and notes that American engineers moved equipment by night convoys toward Innsbruck. Soviet complaints never gained traction in Allied councils, drowned out by disputes over Berlin and Eastern Europe. Operation Silver Ashes remained buried in classified appendices until the 1980s, when researchers gained partial access to OSS records. Even then, large portions were blacked out. The title page survives, listing only date, location, and code word. Its omission from all standard army history speaks volumes. While the world saw parades of surrendered German technology, jet fighters on display, rockets shipped to America, there was also what the Allies chose not to display: the erased fragments too sensitive even to admit existed. What were the Category Red propellants mentioned in the order? One hypothesis is advanced peroxide-based fuels, notoriously unstable but capable of extraordinary thrust. Such materials were later reported in early NATO missile programs. Another theory points to ramjet experiments, hinted at in Luftwaffe papers, but with little surviving evidence. Whatever was hidden in the Steinadler tunnels, it was valuable enough to risk men's lives in the last chaotic days of the war, and dangerous enough to be annihilated rather than shared. By 1946, nothing remained of the mountain facility. Allied engineers bulldozed entrances, covering rubble with soil to conceal the blast scars. Maps of the region omit the precise location. When German archivists later catalogued wartime sites, no mention was made of Steinadler. For decades, hikers in the area occasionally stumbled on rusted fragments of steel protruding from scree, but no one could prove their origin. The men of Silver Ashes faded back into anonymity. Their medals, if any were awarded, do not appear in official rolls. Major Kehoe himself died in 1954, his papers seized by military intelligence. The few lines that survive in his personnel file state only, "Distinguished service in Bavaria, April 1945. Nothing more. The silence surrounding Operation Silver Ashes is perhaps the clearest measure of its importance. Where history records battles, it often erases thefts. In the last hours of the Third Reich, in caverns blasted into alpine stone, secrets were torn out of Germany's dying hands and spirited into the arsenals of a new war. Nothing remains but scorched photographs, fragments of testimony, and the echo of charges detonated beneath a mountain. Silver Ashes, as its code name suggests, left only burned remains, with the truth scattered like dust across archives, redacted and forgotten. Chapter 4: The Forgotten Bunker of Königsberg. When Soviet troops stormed Königsberg in April 1945, they crushed what remained of East Prussia with artillery and flame. The medieval city, once a proud Prussian capital, was reduced to rubble within days. Official Soviet accounts emphasized a triumphant victory and the destruction of German strongpoints in the city's forts. Yet beneath the charred ruins of Königsberg's center lay something stranger and more unsettling. A labyrinth of bunkers tied to Abteilung 7th, the Reich Main Security Office division responsible for research and archives. For decades, these vaults remained only a rumor, until fragments of wartime and Cold War documents revealed what the Soviets had truly uncovered. In April 1945, elements of the Red Army's 11th Guards Army reported seizing encrypted repositories in tunnels beneath Schloss Königsberg, the ancient castle at the city's heart. An NKVD operational logbook, partially declassified in Moscow during the 1990s, refers to the recovery of sealed vaults, dimensions 4mm 10 mates, reinforced steel doors, resistance extreme. Within these chambers were volumes of encrypted documents, described in vague terms as marine traffic correspondence, strategic communications with East Asia, and ciphered commercial ledgers. Soviet engineers carted the crates away under armed escort. None of these materials were ever shared with the Allies. Western intelligence soon realized the gap. A decrypted British intercept from May 1945 notes, Soviets removing archives Königsberg. No visibility of contents. Probability. U-boat signals. Japan traffic. This would explain the sudden disappearance of key Kriegsmarine records that might have revealed the full scope of German submarine operations in the Atlantic. British naval historians, even into the 1960s, puzzled over missing war logs that left gaps in the chronology of Wolfpack deployments. These absences may not have been accidents, but deliberate extractions, spirited away to Moscow. German sources confirm hints of such a cache. Surviving staff from Abteilung 7 testified in post-war interrogations that in January 1945, their unit received orders to move sensitive materials eastward from Berlin, away from advancing American forces. Königsberg, though already under siege, was chosen as a terminal repository. The instruction was to bury what could not be. Evacuated, one SS clerk recalled in 1948. The vaults were to be sealed so the enemy could not access the Reich's last communications. Allied interrogators dismissed these claims at the time, assuming the records had been destroyed. But rumors persisted among Königsberg's surviving civilians. Refugees recalled SS trucks unloading heavy crates at night into castle cellars already reinforced by concrete. Others spoke of workers conscripted to dig passageways that vanished beneath the cathedral square. After the Soviet takeover, civilians were forbidden to approach the castle ruins, and the area was ringed with barbed wire. For years after, East Prussian émigrés whispered that something had been hidden there, something Stalin himself ordered concealed. In 1961, the castle was demolished entirely by Soviet authorities under the pretext of removing fascist ruins. Yet a secret KGB memorandum from that year, uncovered by Russian historians after the fall of the USSR, states, prior to demolition, residual vaults were cleared, material relocated to Archive 482, Moscow region. Archive 482 remains a classified facility. No inventory of its holdings has ever been released. What might have been inside? Theories abound. Some believe the Königsberg vaults contained decrypted Japanese diplomatic cables, evidence of Berlin-Tokyo coordination far deeper than admitted at Nuremberg. Others point to missing documents on Reich economic relations with neutral nations, including Switzerland, Sweden, and Spain, evidence of financial conduits that persisted throughout the war. Still others suggest the archives included naval traffic logs that could expose Allied compromises of Enigma, records too sensitive for either side to admit. A tantalizing clue emerged in 1978, when a former Soviet naval officer defected in Vienna. In his debriefing, he claimed the Soviet Navy had reviewed captured German submarine files from Königsberg that described Arctic convoy interceptions and secret rendezvous with Japanese submarines. He spoke of documents so explosive they would have changed the Allied narrative. His claims were dismissed at the time as Cold War exaggeration, but the details matched those described in surviving German testimonies. Meanwhile, Western intelligence conducted its own quiet investigations. In 1959, MI6 commissioned a study of Königsberg anomalies, noting that gaps in Kriegsmarine records corresponded exactly to the dates and regions where Allied convoys suffered unexplained losses. The report concluded that missing files had been removed en bloc by Soviet forces. The study was classified secret and never released to the public. Even archaeology hints at something unusual. When Polish teams excavated the ruins of Königsberg Castle in the 1990s, they discovered sealed concrete corridors leading nowhere, abruptly filled with rubble. Local workers claimed the Soviets had poured concrete into surviving shafts after 1961, entombing anything they had not already removed. One corridor contained twisted rebar consistent with heavy blast-proof doors. The excavation was halted before deeper exploration could be made. The forgotten bunker of Königsberg thus represents more than just missing documents. It is a case study in how history can be reshaped by silence. By erasing or concealing these records, both the Nazis and the Soviets ensured that vital aspects of the war's endgame would remain obscured. Were U-boats conducting missions to Japan as late as 1945? Did Germany maintain financial channels with neutral governments until the final collapse? Did the Allies suppress knowledge of these ties to preserve post-war stability? Without the Königsberg files, such questions remain suspended in uncertainty. What is undeniable is that the Soviets controlled the narrative. Königsberg, renamed Kaliningrad, became a closed military city, its castle reduced to dust, its bunkers sealed. Western scholars never gained access. Even German reunification did not bring answers. The Bundesarchiv still lists entire categories of Kriegsmarine records as missing or presumed destroyed. But destroyed is not the same as absent. Somewhere, in a climate-controlled vault outside Moscow, cartons of files labelled with German insignia may still sit, unopened since 1945. Their contents, if ever revealed, could alter not only the history of World War II, but the tangled story of the Cold War that followed. Until then, Königsberg's subterranean archive remains an unsolved riddle, buried beneath fire, rubble and silence, the records of a war deliberately forgotten. Chapter 5. The Berlin File Exchange. Of 1948. In the fractured city of Berlin, 1948 marked the beginning of a new kind of war. The guns of the Second World War had fallen silent, but the ruins of the German capital became the stage for a shadow conflict between former allies now turned adversaries. The Berlin blockade and subsequent airlift are remembered as symbols of defiance and survival. Yet beneath the public crisis unfolded a quieter, deadlier contest. In damp cellars and abandoned Gestapo strongrooms, microfilms and dossiers changed hands, traded not for money, but for leverage. Historians call it the Berlin File Exchange, a transaction so sensitive it was erased from official memory. The roots of the exchange lay in 1945, when Soviet troops captured vast stores of Nazi intelligence in the eastern half of the city. These included Gestapo index cards, Abwehr dossiers, and administrative records of occupied Europe. Meanwhile, Western forces secured their own caches in the West. By 1948, both sides realized the power of these files. They contained names of collaborators, industrial connections, and wartime transactions that implicated governments far beyond Germany. To expose them openly would destabilize fragile regimes, yet to possess them meant influence. Thus, in the shadows of a divided Berlin, intelligence officers brokered quiet trades. One of the first references appears in a British SIS memorandum dated October 1948, stamped Berlin sector only. It describes a controlled handover of index material between Soviet GRU officers and a British intermediary at an abandoned post office near Potsdamer Platz. The files involved were microfilms copied from Gestapo employment lists, detailing German agents recruited in neutral countries. In return, the Soviets allegedly supplied partial lists of Nazi informants in the Balkans, information the British valued for counterinsurgency in Greece. The transaction was never acknowledged publicly. American counterintelligence corps officers were aware, but kept at arm's length. A debriefing report from December 1948, authored by Captain Walter Hensley, states, "Evidence suggests SIS engaged in direct file barter with Soviet representatives. Americans excluded to preserve plausible deniability." The report adds, content believed to include compromising details on European officials now serving in Western governments. If true, the files exchanged were not simply remnants of Nazi bureaucracy, but instruments of blackmail. Survivors who worked in the ruins recall strange convoys at night. A former Berlin tram driver testified in 1962 that he saw Soviet trucks pulling up to a collapsed Gestapo building on Prince Albrechtstrasse, guarded by men in civilian coats. Crates were carried out under floodlight, loaded silently, and driven east. Weeks later, British lorries were seen at the same site. Nothing appeared in official salvage records. The driver's account matched the dates of memoranda now in declassified MI5 files. Why trade with the enemy so soon after the war? The answer lies in control. Both East and West inherited a Europe riddled with wartime compromise. Politicians, industrialists, and intelligence officers had crossed lines of collaboration with the Reich. If exposed, these truths could destabilize post-war governments, discredit emerging NATO structures, or undermine Soviet authority in Eastern Europe. Thus, silence was mutually beneficial, but selective silence, guided by what each side chose to suppress or reveal. The files themselves remain elusive. Some fragments surfaced in the 1990s, when the collapse of the Soviet Union briefly opened archives. Russian historians found microfilm reels labeled Archive Gestapo, Berlin 1948, with notes in both Cyrillic and English. One reel contained lists of French industrialists accused of supplying the Wehrmacht while secretly negotiating with British agents. Another reel contained surveillance reports on Italian officials later integrated into NATO. None of this material was ever released in full. Western archives hint at the same pattern. A restricted US State Department file from 1951 refers to sensitive personalities identified in Gestapo Berlin documents, subject to prior Allied Soviet coordination. This phrase suggests an agreement. Certain names would never be published, preserved only in secret indexes for future leverage. The exchange was not a single meeting, but a series of transactions. According to scattered sources, British officers used code names like Operation Lantern to coordinate retrievals. Soviet GRU dispatches refer cryptically to Archiv Handel, the archive trade. The exchanges took place in ruined cellars, railway sidings, and once, according to one fragment, in the basement of a destroyed cinema. Each side brought microfilm copies rather than originals, ensuring both retained leverage while controlling what the other could see. The danger of exposure was immense. If the press had learned that Allied and Soviet officers were secretly trading files during the Berlin blockade, public trust in the airlift effort would have collapsed. Thus, operational security was absolute. Witnesses were silenced, and paperwork filed under innocuous titles like infrastructure clearance or refugee documentation. The real victims were those named in the files. Some collaborators escaped justice entirely, shielded because their names were bargaining chips. Others were quietly eliminated. A Polish émigré living in West Berlin was found dead in 1949, his body in a canal. Stasi files later identified him as a former Gestapo agent, whose name had surfaced in a traded dossier. His murder was officially unsolved. For the intelligence services, however, the exchange provided a toolkit for decades of Cold War maneuvering. A compromised French official might be pressured to align with NATO strategy. A Balkan partisan leader might be discredited by hints of collaboration. A neutral government might be steered by the threat of exposure. The Gestapo's files became not relics but living weapons, wielded in the shadows of divided Europe. By the mid-1950s, the file exchange faded into obscurity, overtaken by larger Cold War confrontations. Yet its traces remain in classified archives, where missing documents are sometimes explained only with the phrase Berlin 1948 transferred. Scholars who stumble on these references find silence beyond that point. The files themselves vanish into sealed vaults in London, Moscow, or Washington. In the end, the Berlin file exchange symbolizes the transformation of war into shadow war. What began as the exposure of Nazi crimes became the concealment of inconvenient truths. Justice was set aside for leverage. History was not written by victors alone, but bartered between adversaries, each concealing as much as they revealed. The ruins of Berlin still hold their secrets. Beneath streets rebuilt with Cold War concrete, cellars remain sealed, their contents long forgotten by ordinary memory. Yet the intelligence archives retain the proof. In 1948, amid starvation and blockade, the Allies and Soviets engaged in a silent bargain, trading fragments of the past to shape the future. The files changed hands, the names disappeared, and the city of rubble became the first true battlefield of the Cold War, not with tanks, but with paper and silence. What you have heard are only threads pulled from a tapestry woven in shadow. Behind the ruins and silence, something colder persists. The awareness that secrecy itself became a weapon. The lines between victor and vanquished blurred when truths were traded, erased, or hoarded in vaults where dust now clings to forbidden names. These are not endings, but corridors with doors still locked. Corridors that run beneath the history we are allowed to know. Somewhere, in forgotten boxes and sealed bunkers, lie the unspoken chapters, stories that refuse to rest. And as long as those fragments remain hidden, the war never truly ended. It only changed uniforms, slipped into the dark and learned how to endure in silence.